It's great to be here, and Diane, thank you for that really lovely introduction and introduction of USIP as well. It's an honor for me to be here with all of you, and an honor to be here with Diane, who's such an important, effective voice here in Washington, and I think you really show the example of marrying passion and conviction with an understanding of how to affect change in Washington, D.C., and for elevating the critical issues of peace at a place where it really matters, Capitol Hill. So thank you, Diane, to you. Thanks to Bridget for the enthusiasm. I just talked to her. And I mean, thank you to everybody here today for taking time out of your lives to be here in Washington, especially for those of you who traveled from outside the city. And I know you've probably heard this many times, but really it matters that you're here and that you're going to talk to people on the Hill tomorrow. Your voice really makes a difference. And so, it's inspiring to me to see so many people here with that collective determination. And I want to start my comments today by invoking my great mentor for more than 20 years. Some of you may know him. He's also a very committed Quaker, a man by the name of Landrum Bowling. I don't know how many of you know Landrum. But I first met Landrum in 1996, the year that both of us joined Mercy Corps. He was the sprightly age of 82, and he joined Mercy Corps to run the Sarajevo office for Mercy Corps, which he did for 2 years, focusing on building bridges of dialogue between the various faith leaders there. And he has been a constant and important influence in my life. He always sees the importance of dialogue, of building bridges. He's worked on Middle East peace for, I think we just calculated, about 70 years. And he also is the person who in 1996 introduced me to the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I've learned in my 20 years of knowing Landrum that he's always peeling back another chapter in this incredible storied life, where casually you learn, because French film documentary people are showing up, that he's the guy who discovered an Algerian massacre when he was a reporter in World War II, and on it goes. But so several months ago, I invited him to lunch at USIP. And he came and met with a small group of our team, and he revealed for the first time that I'd heard that when he was at the Lilly Foundation in the 70s, that he's the one who gave the small seed grant to a determined group of citizen activists, most of whom were Quakers, who were seized with the idea that the United States needed a Department of Peace. And that seed grant enabled them to do the kind of work that led to a citizen movement that pushed President Carter to establish a President's Commission in 1979 to create a U.S. Peace Academy. And that commission report led to legislation that was ultimately signed by President Reagan in 1984. So it was the determination of citizen action and really drawing on Quaker conviction that led to the establishment of U.S. Institute of Peace. So I feel that this is a wonderful opportunity for me then to come and speak to you. And I want to give you just a little laydown of what fruit that action has borne through the years. The USIP mission that Diane alluded to is really to envision a world without violent conflict around the world. And this, I think, very closely echoes the FCNL mission of a world free of war and the threat of war. So we do this at U.S. Institute of Peace by practicing, researching, and training on how to prevent, mitigate, and recover from violent conflict. And we really do this based on the reality that conflict is inevitable. We will always have conflict in our lives, in our communities, but the issue is how do you manage it? Because conflict can actually be transformative, as we've seen through the history of this country. But when it's not managed well is when it can turn violent and deadly and undo decades of development and create, death and terrible destructive suffering. So over the last 30 years, USIP evolved. It was initially quite focused on the study of peace, and it worked with universities around the country to seed the field of peace and to create the profession that understands what works, how do we deal with conflict. We've now, in the post-Cold War period, focused on programs in conflict zones, and I would add to the list that Diane indicated that we now have added Myanmar, Central Africa Republic, Tunisia, which reflects additional areas of attention, and we have representatives in South Sudan. How do you link the learnings from programs actually in conflict zones to the research that helps understand what works and work with a community of practice, connects to training, and connects to policy recommendations? So it's working along that cycle of connection that we seek to be a resource for our government as well as to a community of practitioners so that we can very practically deal with preventing, mitigating, and recovering from violent conflict. I joined USIP in February. I'm the 5th president in its 30 years, the first woman. And this feels very much like a closing of a circle for me, where it's the ultimate fusion institution in that it's both of the government and partly non-governmental, it's operational, but also policy focused. And so as Landrum would say, I feel very rightly led to have this opportunity, and very honored to be working with what is a quite important tool of the United States government in addressing to prevent and mitigate violent conflict. And thank you for this water, because I'm just off the plane. I've been traveling a lot in the Middle East over the last several weeks. I've just come back from Israel, Palestine, from Jordan, from Abu Dhabi, and that trip really underscored much of what we see as some of the critical threats to peace that we need to be thinking about, where you have a region that is consumed with 4 civil wars. It is plagued by a new virulent kind of violent extremism with Daesh. And you've got the outflow of refugees coming from that region as well as through this arc of fragility through the Middle East and Africa. I'm sure all of you are watching the news with the 60 million refugees who are now globally with us at historic levels. The last time that we had anywhere near that many people who are displaced because of violent conflict was at the end of World War II, where there were 45 million. And if the 60 million displaced people were a country, it would be just after Italy in terms of size. So this is a critical moment. And what I would say to you is it's an opportunity to seize this issue, because this is not fundamentally a refugee issue. We will not resettle our way out of this. But we need to be looking at, why are they leaving their countries? Why are people forced to leave? And it's really about fragility, that these are countries that are fragile in the sense of they're either too weak and ineffective to provide the essential services and the security that their citizens need and demand, or they're illegitimate in the eyes of their citizens. Illegitimate in that they are using force to silence dissent. They are, in many cases, on the verge of or have actually committed atrocities. Both of these are forms of fragility that we are seeing in an arc across the Middle East and into Africa in particular. Most indices suggest that there are about 50 countries globally that are fragile and also conflict affected. And this is where we see a concentration of conflict, of poverty, and of the source of refugees, as well as things like Ebola that came to us out of 2 countries that were only beginning to emerge from decades of violent conflict and fragility. So what can we do about it? What should we do about this? What works? because I actually do believe that there are critical strategies that can make a difference. So let me focus on 4 strategies that we see as critical for building peace, and then I'll talk about some of the tools that the U.S. government has. The first is that I want to underscore that we have right now a national security strategy that fully understands this, and this is an important framing that lives within the U.S. government. And I want to just quote a sentence from the U.S. National Security Strategy that says, within states, the nexus of weak governance and widespread grievance allows extremism to take root, violent non-state actors to rise up, and conflict to overtake state structures. So to meet the challenges, we'll continue to work with partners through multilateral organizations to address the root causes before they erupt and to contain and resolve them when they do. This is fundamentally an alternative to military solutions, and it provides an important foundation for how the U.S. is currently thinking about the ways to address this. And I would break it down to the importance of inclusive peace processes, that there is extraordinarily powerful data that suggests when you have only armed actors at the table, you have less probability of an enduring peace. We're seeing this. Good example would be South Sudan, of what happens when it's not inclusive. A very positive example right now is Colombia, where after almost 50 years, that has been a very inclusive peace process, and we are on the verge, hopefully, of having the kind of peace that can really endure in that country that has been war-torn. And USIP has spent a number of years helping to bring internally displaced and women to the peace table, as well as to do training throughout the country so people can participate in the peace process and in what is now being designed and laid down as a reconciliation process. Secondly is the importance of bottom-up approaches. One of the things that I know this community knows very well, but is sometimes hard to put into the official government process, is that peace just doesn't happen only from the top down through treaties, but one needs to work at the community level to create tools and approaches and understandings from the community up so that they can demand and support peace from the top down, as well as ensure that there is peace at the community level. I am very taken by the increased evidence that shows the impact of conflict on brain development, especially for those who are young. And the evidence increasingly demonstrates that that increased stress of conflict, of social exclusion, actually changes the neural architecture of a young brain and has long-lasting effects on the ability of that young person to be the kind of productive contributor to societies that one needs. It leads to lifelong learning difficulties, depression, and even emotional disorders. So, as we look at a place like Syria, where we have had children out of school for going on 5 years and counting, or you look at Palestine, where I just came back from, where you have a new generation with the rise in violence now in Jerusalem. I mean, this is, the longer these conflicts go on, the longer they will extend into the future with these generations who are raised in conflict. So you have to equip individuals and communities as well as governments with these key approaches, tools, and the ability to be mediators, negotiators, to build peace among themselves. When I was in Afghanistan last spring, I met a young woman who's studying law at a university, which in itself is a wonderful breakthrough for Afghanistan. And she was telling me, she was one of the founders of a peace club that I was visiting at this university. She said, my country's been at war for more than 30 years, and that's multiple generations. Our society is just permeated with conflict. And so I joined the Peace Club. I helped to found the Peace Club, she said, because I want to know how to make peace even in my family and my community, because we don't know how to have a disagreement without it becoming violent. So just to underscore what I know a number of you are engaged in, how important that is. And then finally, I would note sometimes you can build peace from the bottom up, even in the absence of an effective top-down approach. I was in Iraq in September. USIP has supported a group of Iraqi facilitators, trained, supported them for the last 5 years. Some of you may remember Tikrit, the story of Tikrit. When Daesh swept into Tikrit a year ago, June, they killed 1,400 Iraqi army cadets, almost all of whom were Shia. So at that point, all the Sunni families fled, not just because of their fear of Daesh, but also because their fear of the retribution that the Shia tribes would exact upon them for retribution just by association, whether or not they had actually been engaged. So this network of Iraqi facilitators saw the danger of, even after Daesh left, that it would just cycle into conflict with tribal retribution, which is the traditional approach that would have taken hold. They met with members of both Sunni and Shia tribes, brought them together. They had a series of dialogues, including in a hotel that was bombed during their discussion, but they kept at it. The result was an MOU between the Shia and Sunni tribes that they would not follow tribal justice, but rather they would use the criminal justice system for those who actually participated, but they would otherwise create a platform of peace that enabled Tikrit to emerge without going into cycles of conflict. And then they had a joint delegation that went to other parts of the country where many of the Sunni families had fled. And with that delegation laid the groundwork for a return of the Sunni families back to Tikrit. Initially, 400 families came. They then worked with the government, the local government, and they've now set up a process where somewhere between 70 and 100,000 people have now returned. So these are the kinds of things that are possible with ground-up action, even when you've got other difficult problems going on at the national level. And so I commend everybody to continue your energy and your effort on working at that level. Third is the importance of multilateral and regional cooperation. And I would just briefly mention that in September, President Obama hosted a peacekeeping summit, which brought renewed energy from a number of states about how do you make our peacekeeping efforts better equipped and more effective, because without security in these environments, it is very difficult for peace to take hold. We rely on our peacekeepers from the UN, but they are woefully under-equipped, under-trained. There's other reform efforts that have to happen. But by working through these multilateral institutions, as you know well, we can leverage our resources and gain greater legitimacy for our efforts. And finally, I want to note to you, number 4, is the importance of normative and group behavior and benchmarks. We celebrated the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. Everybody know what the Millennium Development Goals were? In September, the goals to half extreme poverty, half hunger, half death at childbirth, a whole variety of goals. These, when they were formulated in 1990, were considered to be wildly unachievable, when in fact we achieved them in advance of the goal of the deadline of September. So this is what happens when there's a clear agreed upon agenda and there's global movement around those goals. So this September, we've laid down a new set of global goals. What's important is the goal 16. And I really urge everybody to imprint this. It's terribly wonky sounding, but actually even Senator Corker made a floor statement about the importance of goal 16. So it has penetrated the Hill, and I urge you to help keep this in front of them. Why? Because goal 16 is an historic UN-wide, all the member states voted and agreed upon it, that says we won't go to the next round of addressing poverty, of addressing all of these global goals around women and youth and economic equality without Goal 16 that calls for peaceful, inclusive societies with equal access to justice for all and inclusive, accountable institutions at every level. This is, think about that for a minute. Every country has signed up to that. This is a remarkable admission of the importance of this approach. How, over the next 15 years, we take the power of collective action of this normative agreement and take it into action will be one of the most important opportunities that we have to seize. It's a powerful rallying cry. It sounds terribly quixotic, like, yeah, good luck with that. But it's an opportunity that we need to seize. And so I ask all of you to engage on that. So what are the most important tools for the U.S. government? First of all, I want to just hearken back to the national security strategy. I just remain heartened every day that I think about that strategy because it fundamentally says we need other than military tools to build peace. And so what are some of those tools? Well, I understand tomorrow you're going to the Hill to talk to Hill members about the Atrocity Prevention Board. And so thank you for doing that. I think this is terribly, terribly important. In 2008, U.S. Institute of Peace partnered with the Holocaust Museum and the American Academy of Diplomacy to create the Genocide Prevention Task Force. This task force suggested what peace builders had been saying for many years, which is the earlier we recognize signs for future mass atrocity, the better prepared we will be for preventive action. And in 2011, President Obama took the task force very practical recommendation on how to prevent genocide and mass atrocities and called for the creation of the Atrocity Prevention Board to incorporate the task force recommendations. When I was at USAID, I served as the AID representative to the Atrocity Prevention Board, which was a White House convened body that brought representatives from throughout the interagency. And I actually just recently was looking at the task force again, and it's remarkable, the task force report, it's remarkable how many of the recommendations have been implemented. Why? Because you have a high-level interagency group that meets to coordinate U.S. government action to identify, prevent, and respond to mass atrocities. It directed the national intelligence community to do estimates and to do a preview of what were the indicators of possible signs for mass atrocity so that the intelligence agencies now have that as part of what they are looking for. That gets shared with the Atrocity Prevention Board. And on the basis of that, the Atrocity Prevention Board raises up through the policymaking apparatus issues of concern and mobilizes action. And while I was there, so about 2 years ago, and Bridget can correct me, 2 years ago, right? The Atrocity Prevention Board started looking at Burundi 2 years ago. The national intelligence community said, you know what, there's a lot of indicators in Burundi that suggest this is going to be looking bad, the indicators of the president trying to extend into a third term. So this got early focus by the government when Burundi was not otherwise on the map. This was not a priority for the U.S. government. A lot of other priorities in Africa, Burundi was not one of them. But because the Atrocity Prevention Board focused on it, it enabled some increased attention, laying down of some programs on the ground to support community action, some bridge building, outreach to key partners, to the EU, to the UN, to mobilize action to raise the issue among a broader community, put some very forceful diplomacy in quite early on. And clearly the situation is still extremely tense, and the worst could still happen. I don't want to sugarcoat this at all. But the ability of the U.S. to forestall, even to this date, with our partners, other international partners, has, I believe, forestalled what could already have been a terrible, terrible conflagration. And this is in large measure due to the prior work of the 2 years, the scene setting, the awareness raising, the preventive diplomacy that happened. I understand that a number of you here have worked at the community level to build community tools to prevent conflict, so I believe that has been a part of it. This is a watch this space closely, but the good news is that the U.S. government has this on their screen and has been taking action. So I very much applaud your focus on the looking at how you make the APB a more permanent feature of the U.S. government. I think there is a great danger that it would not be continued into a future administration. There's a really bad habit of new administrations discarding things that the previous ones have done. And so I indeed hope that the legislation that you'll be talking about takes hold. The second tool that I believe is very important for the U.S. government, and I know you have taken this up in the past, is the Complex Crisis Fund. The Complex Crisis Fund is one of the few funding tools that the U.S. government has for unearmarked, flexible funding that can be brought to bear in the event of new information that there might be trouble on the horizon. A lot of the money that we have is either flexible but for humanitarian, or it's for development, and that gets laid down a year or more ahead of time, so that if something comes up, you've got nothing in between except for the Complex Crisis Fund. And when I was at AID, this was the most valuable money. This was the money that we used to fund all of the activities associated with the early response to Burundi, to lay down some additional activities as 2 years ago. This is the money that we used to put some additional peace-building responses into Central Africa Republic. And I understand you'll be talking more about this tomorrow. Central Africa Republic is yet another one of those places that isn't on the map for the administration. But as the violence heated up there, it became a critical place to have focus and action. And we had humanitarian money, but we had nothing else to try to look at the peace-building aspects that were so critical, except for through the Complex Crisis Fund. In 2010, when I joined USAID, there was a $50 million allocation for CCF, Complex Crisis Fund. In 2015, it's down to $20 million. And the trajectory is just continuing to go down. So again, I commend you all to take note of that. Third is the continued investment in multilateral cooperation. U.S. participation, both with funding, with resource, with commitment, is what enables our peacekeeping activities to go forward. Critical diplomacy that happens through and with the UN and other regional bodies, and very importantly, the accomplishment of the global goals, of which Goal 16 is one. So all of this, and then fourth is the work that we do through USAID and State Department on building democracy, rights, and governance. And this is, if you go back, if you think again of the national security statement that I read, and you think about the core causes of fragility, fundamentally it comes down to, is there an effective, accountable, transparent, inclusive government? That is really the heart of it. If you have that kind of government, you can manage conflicts as they come up. You can navigate through conflicts, as we see here in this country. We have conflicts every day, but we have a government system that enables us to address it and move forward. We help other countries develop that through our USAID and State Department funding, and especially through our work through the Democracy, Rights, and Governance Center, which is a part of USAID. Over the last 5 years, the funding for that account has precipitously dropped, such that in a number of African countries we have almost no funding. So all of these four priorities are funded through our international affairs budget as a part of the overall U.S. budget. And just to give you, I know you know these numbers, but it's always interesting to remember them, that our defense budget is $598.5 billion. $598.5 billion. Our entire international affairs budget, which includes all of diplomacy, all of state, all of AID, all of USIP, all of, Millennium Challenge Account, anything that we fund to engage with the rest of the world through civilian means, is $46 billion. 598, 46. $598.46 billion. So there's an extraordinary disparity and room to further increase the important and critical tools that we have to do this peace-building work as a government and to support the vision that is there right now, embodied in the National Security Strategy. By comparison, our budget, USIP, is $35 million. And a number that I like is the Google catering budget, which is $72 million. Just to give you, our budget at USIP is equivalent to less than the cost of one rifle platoon, which is 39 soldiers. So, I mean, the disparities are significant. So I want to close with just underscoring how key U.S. global leadership is. And I wouldn't have said this before I entered government, but it actually matters tremendously. When you have U.S. global leadership, it makes a difference. And how we exercise that difference, that leadership makes a difference. And this was what the citizen activists were saying back in the late 70s, early 80s when they were pushing for a Department of Peace, because it matters what we do. And I'm especially proud, Diane mentioned the building that USIP has on the Mall. I'm especially proud that we have a building with a roof shaped like a dove that is at the end of the mall. And we host many, many school groups who come for their spring vacation, and they tour the mall, and they tour one war memorial after another, and then they come to USIP and have an opportunity to hear about how the U.S. government builds peace. And how we wage peace as effectively as we wage war. And that's an important, the teachers are always very grateful for the opportunity to see the way in which the U.S. engages in building peace. So let me close by invoking Landrum once again. Landrum gets up every morning with a continued commitment to building peace. And he has been working at this for a very long time. Just 2 weeks ago, he told me that he thinks he has one more Middle East trip in him, and he sees some ways and some opportunities to make a difference. He continues to be my great inspiration for continuing to take action in what often seems like a hopeless quest. We also have seen many of the ways in which the activities that you all have done have borne fruit, whether it's actually the establishment of USIP, thank you for all of your efforts on that, the creation of the Atrocity Prevention Board. These are citizen action inspired important innovations that the US government now has. I am an enormous believer of the importance of collective action and the difference that it can make. I look often at Landrum and see somebody who, in a phrase I've learned from the Quakers, he fully inhabits his life. And the kind of action that you all are all here to do tomorrow is about doing just that. And so I give you my gratitude for the work that you're doing. And I would ask, if I could, for all of you to join me in sending birthday wishes to Landrum. His birthday is tomorrow. I'll be celebrating it with him over the weekend as he turns 102. Yeah. There's an inspiration.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Questions? So,
sit down?
No, stand up. Just stand up. So, Nancy is able to take just a few questions, and we have two microphone runners. Mavis and Catherine are going to be doing microphone. I'm going to take probably 2 to 3 questions because we have limited time and see if we can get them all in. let me just say that we do send our warmest wishes to Landrum Bowling as he turns 102. He is a remarkable inspiration to many of us. And some of you may know that we are also celebrating another important birthday of a peacemaker, peace builder, in Ed Snyder, our second executive secretary, who turns 90 tomorrow as well. So, big birthday day. Yeah, November 13th. So, okay, questions. I see Jim, and so some of you may remember we had Reza Aslan speak, and Reza had this thing where it was like boy, girl, boy, girl. So I'd like to see some women's questions as well, women's hands. I'm going to take one from Jim, and women?
Right there, right there.
Okay, right here. Oh, Nalia. Okay, so one here. Catherine, can you come up and take one question from Nalia and then go over to Jim over here? Sure. And we'll do one more from Tom Ewell. Sure. Mavis, you can get Tom right back here.
Thank you, Nancy, for a very inspiring talk. I wonder, how do you keep your optimism when it seems like our government is doing the total opposite of what you are recommending? In particular, when I look at the Trustee Prevention Board, Gaza will be uninhabitable in 2020, which is only 5 years from now. So is that on the radar screen, and what can we do to put it on the radar screen and prevent further funding of Israel? And
very good. Okay, so Tom, let's get Tom's question, and Catherine, can you go over to Jim on that side? Mavis, can you get Tom Ewell?
I totally and heartily support all of the prevention of violence that you have described. But my question is, are you also able to address our own efforts, our own country's war making? Particularly, are you able to address our arms sales issues, our AUMF, the issues of aggressive funding for our military? Is that part of what the USIP can address?
Great question. And Jim, let's take one more and then we'll ask.
Hi, Jim Matlack, Midcoast, Maine. Nancy, thank you so much for your presentation. I want to be sure that those of us who are going on the Hill tomorrow have the language of the National Security Strategy Goal 16, which you gave, so that we have that to be sure we are able to repeat that to the people we talk with tomorrow. I'd also note that one of your predecessors at USIP, Dick Solomon, was not a Quaker, but he was a Westtown School graduate.
Which is a Quaker school. Can you try to answer three different questions?
Yeah. So on the question of Gaza, as I said, I didn't get to Gaza, but I was in the West Bank in Jerusalem. And I think that this is at a very dangerous place right now because Palestinian youth have lost all hope. They don't believe that there's any validity remaining in the Oslo agreement. And I met with a number of Palestinian parents who have spent much of their lives doing conflict mitigation measures, community building, working with Israelis. And they're very nervous and anxious for their children because there is this sense that there's no hope, there's no vision, there's no faith in their leaders. So I share your concern and all the issues specifically around Gaza, which has the highest unemployment globally right now. It's a very dangerous moment to leave it unaddressed while we wait for the next administration. So it is absolutely critical, and I took some small hope in the fact that it was on the agenda with Netanyahu in the meetings last week. But I think we need to do far more and exert U.S. pressure in a significant way to leave the door open for a peace settlement and to put some hope and vision on the table now. And this will really require U.S. leadership. And it will also require political will in this country. And so this is, again, where your voices can make an enormous difference. I mean, there are important concerns that the Israelis have. And it is not in their interest, however, for a new generation of Palestinian youth who are utterly hopeless to to have that unaddressed. It is in everybody's interest for there to be some sense of a possible resolution on the horizon. And I do believe the United States plays a critical role in that, and we need to exert the leverage. We need the political space in this country to see that this is in both the Israelis and the Palestinians' interest. And I don't know if this is an issue that you all take up, but I urge you to do so. The role that USIP plays is we try to bring that reality to the attention of policymakers, and to bring both solutions on the ground connected to the kind of evidence basis for why this makes the most sense, and have that conversation with policymakers to move that forward. And we have been, our second president was Sam Lewis, who I think many of you may know was a very important and influential ambassador to Israel prior to joining USIP. But it's absolutely the right concern. And it's having trouble getting attention right now because, as I said earlier, there are 4 civil wars in the Middle East. There's, Daesh on the loose. You've got a huge number of the refugees are coming from that region. So the region itself it's not even on their agenda. It's not on their list. So it is, I believe, incumbent upon the United States to bring the focus and to bring some options.
I'll just add that some of you may know that Kate Gould and Warda Khalid, who is our Scoville Fellow, Kate's our Middle East policy person, are leaving for Israel-Palestine on Sunday. And we'll be there for a little bit over a week, and we'll be coming back and spending a lot of time doing a couple of briefings on the Hill and doing a lot of dialogue, and we'll be sending out more communications on that. But your folks are telling me you need to kind of wrap up, but you still have 2 questions.
Yeah.
So if we can go
well,
to
and
that.
I also want to say that I went to Israel-Palestine many times with Landrum.
Yeah.
And every time we would go to Ramallah, walking down the street with Landrum, because of the many years he spent engaged with the Friends School there, people would pop out of the woodwork, out of doorways, and hey, Landrum. And so I know that this community has had a profound engagement with that part of the world, and it's important that you continue that. Do we address things like arms sales and the military funding? That's not squarely in what we do, because our mandate is very much looking at conflict overseas. Clearly, there's a connection to that. I forgot who asked that question. Clearly, there's a connection to that, but there are a lot of important groups that have that fully in their focus. Whereas we are looking more at, what I described earlier about how do you build peace in these conflict zones and connect it to research, training, and policy recommendations. And really doing so by trying to emphasize the importance and the high impact and the effectiveness of these other ways of building peace. And a big focus of our efforts right now is on how to counter violent extremism and how to even prevent violent extremism through non-kinetic means, because a lot of the conversation is otherwise focused on counterterrorism and looking at military options for doing that, as opposed to how do you understand what are the root causes, some of the grievances, the marginalization that can often give rise to violent extremism. And then, Jim, absolutely. If you don't have it, Diane, I'm happy to send the language for both the national security strategy that I read and then the Goal 16 that was a part of the global goals.
Thank you. So just to clarify, the national security strategy is a U.S.-based strategy,
yeah.
and the global goals are coming through the UN.
Correct.
Yep.
And I would say on that, again, on that, as we look to the next administration, one of the things that you all may want to keep in mind is, look at the national security strategy, because it has some remarkable language that sets the frame for peace through non-military means, peace through U.S. global leadership that looks at, building a community of nations that are committed to peace, to human rights, to accountable governance. And it's a remarkable document, and it is. It's important that continues to be a part of the discourse and the foundation, even when we don't always hew to it. It's there as an aspirational way to think about our role in the world. Thank you.